the Irish Center. We want to take a moment as well to recognize that today is Giving Tuesday, a day devoted to recognizing and supporting the nonprofit organizations in our communities that we value. Whether you are a member of AJHS, the Glucksman Ireland House, the Kansas City Irish Center, or perhaps another cultural nonprofit that enriches your lives, we invite you to reach out and tender your support for future programming such as this. This evening's conversation will also include a brief Q&A near the end of the discussion. Please write down any questions you may have that will be prompted by our fascinating discussion on the note cards you received at check-in. You'll be prompted by the moderator when it is time to hand your written questions to AJHS staff, who will collect them from you and deliver them to our guests on stage. If you do not have a note card, please raise your hand. Not just yet, and an HHS staff member will come and bring one to you. And now please join me in welcoming author Hasia R and moderator Terry Golway.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. We're in for a terrific discussion about a fantastic book. And the book is called Opening Doors, The Unlikely Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America. And my first question, Hasia, actually is about the title. So I read the book. I can't tell you how well written this book is. I'm so jealous. But after reading the book, I went back to, as we authors will sometimes do, contemplate titles, which often are out of our hands. And I thought maybe a better title might have been The Inevitable Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America. What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's a great question to start with, and so I'm going to pick first on the one thing you said, which is it's often out of our hands. So that was not my title, and I did not choose that, and I had a certain amount of back and forth with the editor, and as has happened in the past, I lost. Okay, and so in fact, the title that I had wanted, Opening Doors, I liked. That was mine. I'll take credit for that. But after the colon, it was how the Irish helped the Jews become American, and that was the story I wanted to tell. And what can I say? But I will give a little answer that perhaps, makes your question, I think, a little, it gives me some grounding in your question, which is that while I don't spend very much time in the book talking about the scholarship and what authors said this and what authors said that in the past, because I think on some level it's just not very interesting, and I wanted to write a book that was going to be readable to a larger audience than just other scholars of American Jewish history who are kind of small in number, but the weight of the scholarship on this subject of the Irish and Jews has been one-sidedly, completely focused on anti-Semitism. And it's this Irish person said that, and that Irish person said that, this newspaper said that, that newspaper said that, lots and lots of talk about Father Charles Coughlin, who, he really was there, and other pretty well-known figures in the Irish community who spewed forth anti-Semitic rhetoric. A lot of talk about Irish boys, it's always boys and only boys, beating up Jewish boys, it's only boys, on the street. And that's the story that has come down to us from one scholar to the next, to the next, to the next. And it struck me, partly having had to give a talk at Glucksman Ireland House, that there's another story. And I don't deny that those things happened. You can't. They were real. But they are only part of the story. And so the unlikely is perhaps a nod to the historiography, which you can take that for what it's worth. But I think the inevitable is also a really good way of thinking about it, that there was a kind of trajectory in that moment in time from the late 19th into the early 20th century that made the alliance, made it go.
Well, one of the things that I think made it go, and in my own work on Tammany Hall and sort of the Irish side of things, is that there's one thing that the Irish Catholics, there are Irish Protestants too, but Hasia mostly deals with Irish Catholics. The one thing the Irish Catholics and Jews had in common were they weren't Protestant. And that was really important at the time. I mean, today, at least among Christians, the idea of there being, anti-Catholicism or even disputes among Protestants, we don't really think of it too much. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as Al Smith discovered, that was real. That it was Franklin Roosevelt who once said that Jews and Catholics are here under sufferance because this is a Protestant country. So what united, you tell this in the book, and we've had conversations about this, that the Irish Catholics and Jews were on the same team, so to speak, in some of these cultural wars that happened that you narrate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and the story in a way, I mean, I was very influenced by a lot of your writing on Tammany Hall, so my hat off to you, and I learned amazing things from your writing on that, and you directed me by your in your writing to the papers of Johnny Ahern, which were amazing. He was kind of New York Tammany politician, and his papers are at the New York Historical Society, but in many other zones as well. It was the Jews and the Irish Catholics who stood against a kind of Protestant hegemony, and neither one was going to be able to tackle it on their own. Both had something to gain. Both were interested in penetrating that and, shall we say, dismantling it and getting in, but Jews could never do that on their own. And so it goes actually even back to the 1840s when Bishop Hughes is leading the campaign against the Protestant domination of the New York public schools, and the Jewish newspaper editors and rabbis are also concerned about that. And they actually talk to Hughes, like, how are you going to, what can we do together? And it happens in Cincinnati, it happens in other cities as well, where the Jews have to turn to the Catholics, which means Irish, to get at that Protestant establishment.
Right. At one point, Bishop Hughes, who is nobody's idea of a progressive, but at one point, Bishop Hughes says, where the Jew is oppressed, stand with the Jew. He's telling that to his Catholic flock in the 1840s. So we see that, and certainly Bishop Hughes, for those of you who don't know, he was the first Archbishop of New York City. He was the bishop from the 1830s through to 1863 or so. He started the new St. Patrick's Cathedral. But Hughes was a fierce cultural warrior, and he was determined to create a space in Protestant America for his Catholics, but also for Jews as well.
So let me just give one other example. So in the 1890s, the sort of Protestant Boston Brahmin kind of elite put forth a bill in the Massachusetts legislature to ban kosher slaughtering on the grounds that it was brutal to animals. Now, that may or may not be true. That's not our topic here on the morality of kosher slaughtering, but the bill was defeated because all the Irish Catholics, Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Lowell, in the legislature voted against it. Okay, there was only one Jew in the legislature, so it wasn't the Jews who defeated it. Now, each one of them could go back to their constituents, okay, and say, look, I kept kosher slaughtering for you. You can now have kosher meat.
Right. And some people would say, well, that's political pandering. Well, maybe, but it got done, right? And I've often heard that criticism of Tammany's relations with the Jewish community. Well, they were doing it for votes. They're politicians. Hello,
what else do they want?
Yeah, but I want to deal with a couple of topics because you have the book so well organized. It's amazing. But you start off with a chapter called Meeting Places, where Jews and the Irish Catholics literally are sharing space And you talk about partnerships like the songwriting partnership between William Jerome and Gene Schwartz. You talk about Ed Flynn, the boss of the Bronx, and his law partner, Monroe Goldwater. I'll talk about George Burns and Gracie Allen, right? But the point is that Jews and the Irish Catholics were sharing space in New York and other cities as well. And meeting places. One of my favorites of the examples that you give was of Abe Kiviat, who was an Olympian. He won a gold medal in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm. He also lived on my native borough of Staten Island. But Abe Kiviat was a member of the Irish American Athletic Club and trained at the Celtic Park in Queens. So how does that happen?
Well, and again, it goes back to your first question, because Jews were barred from most of the athletic fields run by, and they weren't officially Protestant, but by the major athletic fields and arenas. So they turned to the Catholics, they turned to the Irish, and used their space. And the other athletic fields didn't allow drinking on Sunday. They, in fact, a lot of them were closed on Sundays. Okay, out of deference to the Christian Sabbath. The Catholic ones were open. The Gaelic, the Celtic Park was open. So it was, that takes us back a little bit, I think, or not a little bit, takes us back to your inevitable phrase that if the Jews want to have athletics, they have only one place. There are not enough of them to have their own facilities. Okay, but they are able to piggyback on what the Irish have built.
Right. And another meeting place is over nationalism and Zionism, where we see Irish nationalists, you talk about Irish nationalists who are supporting Zionism, and Jews who see the Irish struggle in America for free Ireland, and Ireland free of the British. And there's a coming together there as well.
Mm-hmm. And Irish speakers come to Zionist organizations to give talks about what they do and how they do it, and vice versa. And there was one, somebody who wrote into a Jewish newspaper, he's actually from Springfield, Massachusetts, who said, we can learn a lot from the Irish. They're the ones who can teach us how to do nationalist politics. Okay, what's wrong with us? Why can't we be more like them?
Interesting. Another chapter which has a striking title, which surprised me and might surprise most readers, is another chapter is entitled Defending the Jews, which again maybe goes against our preconceived notions of what Irish Catholics did, defending the Jews. And you start off with an anecdote by a journalist, about a journalist named Mary Boyle O'Reilly, who is the daughter of a very well-known Irish immigrant nationalist and poet from Boston, John Boyle O'Reilly, who died in 1890. His daughter goes to Kyiv in Ukraine to cover a trial of a Jewish boy who is accused of murdering a Christian boy in this ridiculous ritual, and she's covering it and saying this is an outrage, that this clearly innocent Jewish boy is being tried. And what Hasia tells in the book is that this incident, in Kyiv, leads to a great outpouring of support for Mary Boyle O'Reilly and also for the accused as well.
Right. So, I mean, interestingly, we're here at the American Jewish Historical Society, and one of the first honorary member of the American Jewish Historical Society was Charles P. Daly, okay, a judge, Irish nationalist, and Charles P. Daly wrote the first American Jewish history book. Okay, so the field of American Jewish history is actually built on the work of this Irish Catholic
Tammany politician.
Tammany politician,
yes.
Through and through.
Right.
And he also writes the first history of the Jews of New York. And he shows up at all the Jewish cornerstone for this and 50th anniversary of that. And he has a message which is again directed at the Protestant elite, which is the Jews are not aliens. They've been here since the 17th century. They take care of their own poor, so don't accuse them of being leeches on society. And they have contributed so much to the United States or to New York. And so this is a kind of Jewish defensive position articulated by an Irish Catholic who, in a way, the American Jewish Historical Society can say has a partnership with him.
Right. Another point of contention or a point of agreement happened exactly 100 years ago in 1924 when Congress argued and then successfully and then passed the immigration quotas of 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, which saw Tammany Irish politicians united with figures like Rabbi Stephen Wise and Fiorello LaGuardia, three people who normally don't have a whole lot in common, but one thing that they supported, the three of them saw in the Immigration Act of 1924 was what it was, a racist document that was designed to basically make America white again, right. in essence, right? Because the argument of the immigration restrictionists at the time was that Italians weren't really good Americans, you know, Eastern Europeans were not. So this is an argument that the Irish really don't necessarily have a dog in that fight because there's some limitation on the Irish Free State, but it's still pretty high. But the Irish politicians like William Bork Coughlin and others see what this is about and unite with Jewish activists here in New York.
Yeah, and nationally also. So in Congress, just about every Irish American politician votes against the 1924 Act. Okay, so that, and is involved in the failed effort to prevent it from passage. Yeah, they're working with Emanuel Seller and who's also connected to Tammany to prevent this from going through, and are pretty much there throughout the effort to keep immigration open.
Your story about Emanuel Seller was interesting, that he was involved in trying to overturn or trying to prevent and then later reform the 1924 Immigration Act, and is still active when the Immigration Act of 1964 comes about. So there's an argument against term limits, I suppose, because he actually got his revenge in a way legislatively.
And the law bears his name, the Hart-Celler Act.
That's right, that's right. I just want to read, there's so much in here that, such fabulous prose that I'm going to, a couple of occasions, quote from some of Hasia's writing, although this is actually from a quote that she found that an Irish-American orator gave this speech in 1929. And he says, when the Irishman, now he's talking about the Irish in Ireland, when the Irishman sees his cabin leveled to the ground, his family huddled on the roadside, the spears of the redcoat making him a world outcast, he looks to a new start in a distant land, meaning immigration. When the Jew in the hinterland of Russia saw the Cossack coming with fire and sword, he knew that the religious and racial hatred had unleashed their fury against his people. And when the storm had passed and the dead were laid to rest, he followed the path of the fugitive son of Erin and became his neighbor in the land of hope. So that speaks to precisely what we've been talking about, that some, not all, but some Irish, but particularly Irish Catholics who are leaders in the community, saw the similarity in exile. The exile was the same for both of them. And there was this commonality, which is so striking to read because, as we know, this is not necessarily the stereotype. And then Hasia goes a little farther back in history than I had anticipated as I was reading, to talk about Governor Dongan, who was the first Catholic governor of colonial New York. I was born in Dungan Hills, Staten Island, named for the governor. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about why he has a place in this story.
Well, he has a place in this story, not because I studied the 17th century, okay, but rather the Irish American Historical Society was its annual publication was a venue for articles about him. And so it was really interesting to me that in the 20s, when immigration restriction was such a hot issue, there were a flurry of articles about this Lord Limerick, right. And that he was the one who granted the Jews religious tolerance in New York, in the colony of New York. And so they made so much of this, so many articles appeared probably way out of proportion to the significance of the subject, which again is the, I think, at the heart of this, I'm going to, again, tip my hat to inevitable alliance that the Irish chose to tell their story as a story of tolerance towards others, of religious liberalism, and doesn't matter if it was true or not. What matters is it was directed at those Protestants, okay, who were in the 20s in multiple ways erecting barriers against Jews. Right. And so telling the story of this governor of New York from the 18th century, telling it in the 1920s was very political, and it was a kind of emblem of that alliance. Right. And what one group, the Irish, had to gain from standing up and defending the Jews. Right.
And on the issue of politicians, Hasia has another chapter called Gatekeepers, which sort of plays to whatever strength I may have. It's about politicians, or people I write about, and the ways in which the Irish politicians in Boston and New York and elsewhere, served as gatekeepers and did, find a way of sharing power with the Jewish community. But one story that I think is illustrative of how maybe some Jews felt about the way Irish Catholics, particularly in a city like Boston, basically stood up to the Protestant establishment. Hasia quotes from the writer Nat Hentoff, who is recalling his childhood in Boston, where the mayor is James Michael Curley, who is nobody's idea of a reformer. Yes, he served time in the big house for various offenses, but he was very popular, not just among his fellow Irish, but as we'll see, also with the Jews. And this is Hentoff talking about growing up in Boston, and he sums up why Curley was such a popular figure among the Jews. And he says here, as Curley is facing the Brahmins in Boston, the Irish couldn't get into their clubs. The Jews couldn't, but because of Curley, the Brahmins couldn't get into City Hall, right? and so there's that symbiosis again, where a young Nat Hentoff is looking at James Michael Curley and saying, he's keeping our common enemy at bay.
Absolutely, and it's again that common enemy that I think is the kind of elephant in the room.
Yeah. Now, at least in my view, you can't talk, and you don't, of course, you can't talk about the relationship between the Irish and the Jews, particularly in this time period, without talking about the greatest governor in New York history, Alfred E. Smith, who was famous for his relationships with Jews, 3 in particular, who were part of his administration. What do you think about Al Smith that allowed him to bring Robert Moses, Bell Moskowitz, and
Lehman.
And
Herbert Lehman.
And Herbert Lehman into the club?
Well, I think what it was is he was a brilliant politician, right. And he saw that this is an important base of votes, and I think it was, the question is, was somebody sincere or not is probably beside the point. Okay, I mean, how do we know if somebody was actually sincere? But it was a brilliant political calculus that in order for Tammany and for him as such to hold on to power was to share it, and the people to share it with were the Jews. The Jews were going to be the loyal acolytes. And
Tammany's chosen people.
Tammany's chosen people, you wrote that. And I should say, by the way, Curley at one point said about Boston, said, I'm not interested in the Italians. He said, they don't vote.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, I mean,
I'm not interested in them. I want the Jews.
Right.
Okay.
And historically, that's true. As we study migration from the early 20th century and late 19th century, what we find, of course, is that Jews come and stay. But the Italian migration at that time was very much a migration. A lot of young Italian men came here and then left as the work cycle changed and then came back. They tended to not register. And frankly, when you're a Tammany politician or any politician, right, you're interested in people who vote, right? And I often tell my students that. You don't want to vote? Sorry, you don't count. I mean, no one's going to come courting your vote if you don't. And Tammany did not court the Italian vote as they did the Jewish vote. One question I have for you too is we've talked about how, in some ways, that the Irish have helped the Jews become American and how they influenced the Jewish community, particularly in the area of politics. How did the Jewish vote, which tended on many occasions to be a little bit left of many Irish Catholics, how did that influence the way Tammany Hall changes in the 19-teens and 1920s, where all of a sudden this political machine is now a force for social reform? Your workplace reforms, safety, minimum wage, all of the things that we think of as a social safety net are actually the legislative work of Tammany Hall. Yes, dreaded Tammany Hall. And I've often wondered, at around the same period, the Lower East Side is sending socialists to the state assembly. They are promptly kicked out. Well, Al Smith didn't want them kicked out. And Jews have elected Mayor London to Congress. So what are the Irish learning from that?
So if they want to keep the Jews vote, they have to essentially respond to the issues the Jews were concerned with, were factory conditions and the kind of economic justice issues that were at the heart of, in a sense, they migrated for a better life. Okay, the conditions they faced were oppressive and were organizing, and some of them were turning to socialists, giving their vote to the socialists. And Tammany essentially says, if we want to stay on top of the heap, we got to court the Jews by touching on their issues. But I do want to say that it wasn't just the Jews who play a role in this, but I want to give some credit to a number of Irish American women, particularly Leonora O'Reilly from the labor movement, who really is the go-between between Tammany and the other Irish politicians and the Jews in the labor movement.
I'm going to get to the labor movement in one moment, but I want to read another bit of your prose, which I really enjoyed. And here Hasia is explaining why so many Jewish voters, migrated to Tammany and what they learned from Tammany. And she writes, they had never, this is about Jewish immigrants now, they had never before been players in such an elaborate game in which non-Jews wooed, courted, and appealed to them, arose as their champions, flattered and rewarded these millennia-old pariahs for the singular and easy goal of getting their votes. They may not have immigrated to America because of the nation's robust participatory democracy for white men, but such politics shaped their lives and expanded the opportunities they could take advantage of in this land in which the majority of them flocked. So Tammany is opening doors, and these doors had been closed to them in the old country.
Or didn't exist at all.
Or didn't exist at all. Right. The next chapter, which leads very nicely from what Hasia just said, is called Bread and Roses, and it's about the labor movement and the interrelationships between the Irish, who are very prominent. A lot of, I think I can say this with my last name, Golway. A lot of Irish Catholics today have forgotten how active Irish Catholics were in the labor movement. The Knights of Labor, the first nationwide labor union, was founded by a guy named Terence V. Powderly, who was also mayor of Scranton. He was the son of Irish immigrants. But what's striking about this chapter, Hasia, is the role of women, Irish women and Jewish women in the labor movement. It's astonishing.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, one of those kind of historic dramas that has really been untold, and I really felt that was my job, partly to bring that to life. But certainly within the American Jewish circles, American Jewish history circles. There's a great celebration of the Jewish women in the labor movement, women like Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman and Bessie Abramowitz and so many more. And it just seems like, well, they did this. This was kind of a product of their own hard work, their own imagination, their own grit and determination. And yet when you take each one of those women's stories, they were all mentored and tutored and encouraged and pushed by Irish women in the labor movement.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I was really intrigued by your telling the story of the relationship between Lenora O'Reilly and Rose Schneiderman. I was very struck by that.
Right, so Schneiderman was certainly conscious of the conditions of work and the need for some kind of redress of the workers' conditions, but what to do with that anger, what to do with that vision. And it was O'Reilly who essentially taught her what it meant to organize a union, to get people, to get other women to sign on, to be able to endure, and to how to, just literally how to do it. And in a way, there's a very interesting sort of backstory to this, which is that most of those Jewish workers who faced these oppressive work conditions were employed by other Jews. Okay, it was a very unique field in American industry that Jewish workers worked for and were oppressed by their fellow Jews. And O'Reilly's telling Schneiderman constantly, yes, you can be loyal to your people, but you have to think about the other women and the workforce and the conditions of labor. And so it was a really powerful relationship that brought those two together. But it was O'Reilly who's the spark, okay, and Schneiderman the one who kind of catches it.
And the reason as an Americanist myself, as an American historian of this time period, I'm certainly familiar with Rose Schneiderman and the role that she played, particularly after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, whatever. But I shouldn't admit this, I suppose. But I knew of Lenora O'Reilly, but I had no idea of the influence she had. So where did you uncover that story? Please tell me. What did I miss?
On one level, it's all over the history of women in the labor movement.
Right.
And it's in Schneiderman's writings and her homage she pays to O'Reilly.
So Rose Schneiderman is very self-consciously saying, I learned this from Lenora O'Reilly.
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
And it's very interesting that it was Irish women labor activists not only inspired and guided Jewish women, but they also play a role in inspiring and guiding Jewish men. And so there's a wonderful story from Chicago where Sidney Hillman, who was the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and in the 30s, supposedly, whenever Roosevelt had a question about labor, he said, clear it with Sidney. Nice. So he was really quite a powerful figure by the 30s. So he's a young worker in a men's clothing factory in Chicago, and he thinks the union that it was that was in the men's clothing field was totally ineffective. He wanted to form a new union, okay, a competing union to the United Garment Workers, and so on the suggestion of John Fitzpatrick, the head of the Chicago Federation of Labor, he goes to a woman named Agnes Nestor, who had founded the Glovemakers Union, daughter of Irish immigrants, and she gives him point by point by point how to go through the process of getting the union started from the ground up. And so in her autobiography, she says, can you believe I taught Sidney Hillman how to form a union? So that, and also, by the way, Louis Brandeis, who becomes, as a Supreme Court justice, one of the great advocates for labor, and he said, I never thought about labor until I heard a speech by Mary Kenny O'Sullivan.
who you should say it was a fourth grade dropout?
Yeah. Okay, shows how unimportant education is. Yeah, so she was Mary Kenny at the time. And he says, I listened to Mary Kenny talk about the strike at Haverhill, town in Massachusetts, and I suddenly saw how you couldn't deal with the problems of capitalism without labor. Okay, so this influence of these Irish women was tremendous.
And not just limited to the labor movement, because in the next chapter in Hasia's book, it's called Classroom Lessons. And again, my eyes were opened here too, because of the influence of Irish Catholic teachers in the public school system. Now, I'm somebody who was parochial school educated until college. And you know, when I think of teachers, I think of nuns. There were some back then, not so many, but I was amazed to find out that at one point you say that American-born daughters of Irish immigrant women were the largest ethnic group among teachers in New York City in, I guess, the early 20th century.
And Chicago and Boston as well.
Which had a profound effect because unlike some Irish Catholics, as Hasia points out, it wasn't most Irish Catholics, but some Irish Catholics obviously went to parochial schools like myself, but Jews did not, for the most part. Jews were in public schools being taught by the daughters of Erin.
Right. And so those women in the classrooms were the models for immigrant kids or the children, the American-born children of Jewish immigrants. What did an American sound like? How did an American look? How did an American dress? How did an American present herself? And nearly all the stories, and obviously this is heavily anecdotal because it doesn't lend itself to any kind of statistical analysis, but there's a huge sort of trove of personal reminiscences of, again, these boys and girls when they became men and women and wrote autobiographies and memoirs and so on about their early years, was how much they loved those teachers and how the teachers were essentially sympathetic to them and how the teachers were just inspirational. And so Nat Hentoff actually tells the story in his autobiography called Boston Boy that he was a desultory student. He had no interest in going to high school. It was a time when high school was was not the norm. And he said he came home one day and there was his school teacher, Miss Sullivan, sitting in the kitchen with his mother. And Miss Sullivan was telling him he should go to high school. Okay, he's really smart, he should go to high school. And in fact, he's capable of getting into the Latin school, which was the sort of top of the Boston educational, it's on the stratosphere there. And he said if not for her sitting there and having tea with the mother, he would have never gone to high school. And then he in fact talks about when he enters the Latin school, back to our Protestant Yankee enemies there. He said, I walked down that hall with all the portraits of the previous graduates, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He says, I'm now one of them. And it was because of that teacher who, in a sense, told his mother he can do it. And this runs through the narrative of these immigrant kids, and again, the way in which this fueled their movement into American education, and as such, into the middle class.
Before we move on to questions, which we will in a second, I mean, I'm obliged to also point out that Hasia has a chapter on Father Coughlin and Hitler resisting the forces who were resisting Father Coughlin. And in the couple of minutes we have remaining, because God knows we could talk about that all day, but I wonder if you could talk about somebody I was immensely interested in and who I've written about, Jeremiah Mahoney, who was a candidate against LaGuardia. He was the sacrificial lamb candidate against LaGuardia in 1937, but also emerges as one of the critical Irish Catholic voices against Father Coughlin and against Hitler in the mid-30s.
And he's an athlete as well as a judge, and he was the president of the Amateur Athletic Union and therefore served on the American Olympic Commission. And he led the movement to try to get the United States to boycott the Berlin Olympics. And a number of Jewish athletes had approached him and said, could you do this for us? Because we can't do it ourselves, back to defending the Jews. And he commissions research on what's going on in Nazi Germany. What would the Jewish athletes face if they went there? And he failed. Avery Brundage was quite a forceful figure to send the United States to the Olympics. And Mahoney drops off the Olympic Commission. But he was the voice. Okay, by the way, Al Smith was with him also, helping him on that, to have the United States, in a sense, engage in this really important, perhaps symbolic act, but still important act of saying, we're not going to Berlin, and essentially saluting Hitler.
Right. And of course, it's amazing, as something of a sports historian myself too, I can understand why the impetus was there to boycott the Hitler Olympics, because that's what they were, right? But if you boycott the Hitler Olympics, you don't get Jesse Owens, you know? So there was that too. And of course, Marty Glickman, great New York figure. Some of us who maybe have a little snow in our hair might remember Marty Glickman as the voice of the New York Knicks. He was on a relay team in the '36 Olympics. This is his chance to win a gold medal. And the team didn't run him because he was Jewish and thought it would offend Hitler. I think I have that history, right? Is that right, Hasia? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to work with Marty when I was at the New York Observer. He was our sports writer. So thank you for this great conversation. We're not leaving yet, though, because we're going to have questions brought up. Is that how yes. Just one more. But I will tell you this much. Go out and buy this book. Do it right after you leave. Not now, because you're paying attention to us, but it is immensely readable. And if I hopefully will try to say this in as least an offensive way as possible, I've been a journalist and an academic, right? And the joke sort of is, somebody once, an academic once said to me, oh, that's a pretty good book for a journalist. Well, my return is, that's a pretty well-written book for an academic. I don't have to say that about Hasia's book. Hasia's book is well written, full stop, and well worth the investment. You will learn a lot, as I did. And we're almost ready for questions. Hasia, how long did it take you to? This always interests me. Because I feel very competitive. How long did it take you? How long did it take you to write and research the book? And those are two actually different questions, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'd say about 5-ish years. I mean, in a way, the pandemic was wonderful for me because I didn't have anything else to do other than to sit at my computer, and yeah, I'd say about 5 years, 5-6 years.
And
no, maybe 7.
Was the research interrupted at all because so many places were closed?
You know, it forced me to look, or it allowed me to look at sources I might not otherwise have looked. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, it certainly was a handicap. And the New York Historical Society was really quite good about sending documents.
Really?
And,
oh, nice.
And also the New York Public Library. And so there were some really important collections there. You know, the fact is I could have kept researching further and further. And
you always can, right?
You always can, yeah. And I, you know, kind of ended the research when I said, I think there's a story here, and I think my hunch is right. And I think one of my views, my attitudes generally as a historian is I'm going to write what I'm going to write, and if somebody finds fault with it, let them write a book too.
That's right.
That's right.
Write your own book.
And the fact is, if it inspires 3 or 4 or 5 other books that say I'm wrong, that's great. Okay, I don't have to be right. I want to get the issue out there.
Right. Well, here's a couple of questions, one of which I would wish I had thought of myself. What is the Irish Catholic relationship and perspective towards Jews during Easter week and the Passion story? Well, I'm sorry, I misinterpreted the question the first time I read it, but I read it correctly. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I mean, the liturgy for the Easter Passion certainly has lots of references to the Jews as responsible for the crucifixion and all that. The Jews were not interested in changing the Catholics' religion, and the Catholics weren't interested in changing the Jews' religion. This was about how to function in a multi-ethnic society, a democratic multi-ethnic society, when you always needed allies.
Right.
And what they did religiously was essentially nobody else's business.
Right.
And so, certainly one of the complaints among my fellow American Jewish historians as well, their priests were always, thundering on about the Jews and the crucifixion. Well, for one thing, we don't necessarily know that. I mean, who is, we don't know what those sermons were.
I have never heard a sermon like that myself.
Right, so. But I mean, it's certainly baked into the Catholic theology. This is part of the narrative, right? That the Jews were responsible, and it's not until 1965 and the Vatican II that is removed.
Yeah, most of the Easter services that I've gone to, Easter masses, and during Holy Week, I mean, priests today put everything in context in a way that I think is satisfactory. But anyway, this is a good answer. One more, a couple more. Do you have a sense of how much Irish and Jewish families socialized with each other, especially considering most Irish kids went, some Irish kids went to Catholic schools. Right. Probably not most, but, but certainly
majority went to public school.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not the kind of, I mean, it's a great question, and the answer, however, cannot be derived from statistical or government or any other kinds. The sources have to be anecdotal, and it's the kind of weight of all of those anecdotes together. And the answer is they pretty much got along. They weren't necessarily best friends, but they got along. And there's a wonderful article it was in a Chicago Yiddish newspaper, and it was specifically on this question. So the author, it's in a Yiddish newspaper, so the author is Jewish, and he says, Pat and I meet on the stairwell every day, and we go down the stairs together, we talk. Our talk is very pleasant, it's superficial, but it's very pleasant. And he says, every once in a while, Pat says something, and he right away apologizes. Okay, so we can imagine what Pat might have said, but the author then goes on to say, but you know what, I can't fault him because we talk about them too. Okay, and we talk about how much they drink, we talk about how their accents, how bad their accents are, how their food smells so bad, and how much they yell at each other. So he says, but our wives and children just are good friends. So the wives are in and out of each other's apartments, and the kids play together downstairs. You wouldn't know who was what.
Could you please speak to the role of Irish servant girls in the socialization of Irish families and Jewish women? Now, by the way, Hasia has written a book called Aaron's Daughters in America. You can buy that after you buy this one. Excellent.
That was also a long time ago. Yeah. Well, there's a class of Jews who are not immigrants but the book pretty much starts in the 1870s, 1880s. And there's a class of Jews in the United States who are longtime Americans. Their families may have come in the 1820s or 30s or 40s. They have done relatively well. They are quite integrated into American society. So they're often called German Jews. They're not necessarily German, but they are a comfortable class. And certainly they had Irish servants. Okay, and the place where one sees commentary about them is in the English language Jewish magazines of the period, where these are magazines that appeal to an English reading Jewish public. Okay, newspapers like the American Hebrew. And they make a lot of reference to the Irish servant girls. And I think notably, they engage in the same, I'm not judgmental about my subjects, but the same pretty obnoxious stereotypes about Irish servant girls as you would find in the Protestant press. Right. Okay, but in a way, my subjects are really the, the 2.5 million East European Jewish immigrants who come after the 1870s. And in a way, one of the things that, and this is off base to the question, but that one of the things that divides the well-settled American Jews, okay, and the East European newcomers is in fact Tammany Hall. And the well-settled, well-off, again, highly acculturated American Jews are primarily Republican. They're very reform-oriented, both religiously and, importantly, politically. They're progressive. They hate Tammany, and they hate the fact that the East European Jews are all flocking to Tammany. Okay, descending to the lowest level, they write.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hasia also points out that during the height of the progressive movement, which as we realize more and more was not actually very progressive, but during that period of reform that we associate with, say, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century, that Jews, many Jews were socialists and reformers back then, but other Jews realized that these progressives actually were not particularly friendly to Jews or Irish Catholic, which again helped form those political bonds in places like the Lower East Side and other places in Boston as well, because the progressives, who were, for the most part, high-born Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they were, again, the common enemy. So that, and when they spoke poorly of Tammany Hall, a lot of Jews, from what I've read, sort of took that personally too, right? And who was behind the National Origins Act of 1924? Progressives. Right. Anyway, here's another question. Can you speak to the aftermath of Charles Coughlin and the Nazis of Copley Square?
Well, I mean, Coughlin was, I mean, he was there, he was powerful. I think the estimate was he had about a 30 to 40 million person, listening audience. His language could not have been more incendiary and anti-Semitic. I'd say, he really, deserves the label anti-Semite. One of his first broadcasts after Kristallnacht was "Wait till Hitler comes to America," he and the Christian Front had these massive rallies. They attacked Jews on the street. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, what was the aftermath of that? Well, many Irish Catholics are, in a sense, organized against him. And when there is, after his, the Kristallnacht broadcast, or the broadcast after Kristallnacht, it is immediately followed by a broadcast by concerned Catholics to condemn him. And what they say in that, which in ways I thought really illuminating, is it's going to have people think we're a bunch of bigots. Okay, it's going to ruin our reputation in America, which we have been working so hard to build up our reputation in America. It's going to bring it down, and it's going to divide our church, because he said half the people hate Coughlin. Okay, so in a way, the aftermath is that he becomes a center of controversy, not just for Jews, but for Irish Catholics.
Oh, sure, he's bad for the Catholics.
Right.
So to speak, right?
And indeed, in Boston, the person who really takes him on is a young woman named Frances Sweeney. And she actually is the first person to hire Nat Hentoff, and his memoir is dedicated to the memory of Frances Sweeney. And she organizes against him. She goes to speeches by his allies and stands up and screams, in a sense, as an Irish Catholic, I take offense at what you're doing. So it becomes a storm center within that population.
Right. Well, we've reached nearly the end of the program, but first of all, there will be a book signing afterwards, which hopefully you'll all stay for.
That's
right. But I will leave you with one other bit from Hasia's book, which is very early on. In fact, it's page 7, where she talks about these two songwriters, William Jerome, who is actually William Jerome Flannery, and Gene Schwartz, and they wrote a song called "If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews." And one line, this is just one line from it, says, "If it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews, Uncle Sam would have the blues." Thank you very much.
That was lovely.